I'm Dorothea Arnold from the Egyptian Art Department. And of course, we have the great pleasure and honor to hear somebody special today. Professor Geoffrey Martin. When I was thinking of what I should say in order to introduce him, I really remembered how we first met many, many years ago. I don't dare even to think how many, but you do. Maybe you don't remember the same occasion. He came from walking through the desert and looking for samples. Is that the one you remember? Looking for samples for C14, which then was a big thing done in Oxford and came out as an important first step into C14 dates of ancient Egypt. And then, of course, I also remember when he came back from Saqqara and said, I think I know where these New Kingdom tombs are. So, of course, it was true. And then he found the tomb of Haremhab. And that is really that he's now, as such, as the discoverer of that tomb before Haremhab became king, he is the one who wraps up our exhibition, really. It will be still up there until July the 4th. But in a way, today we are sort of giving it a peak moment after the conference and the symposium yesterday. And we are really very, very honored that you are ready to talk to us for a whole evening program. Of course, you know that Professor Martin is Professor Emeritus of the University College in London. He was actually Edwards Professor of Egyptology there. And he is now still continues, of course, to work as a scholar. And he has close connections in Cambridge. He lives in Cambridge to the Christ College, where he is a fellow commoner. That's the expression, which is, I'm sure, medieval or something. Anyway, please welcome Professor Martin.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arnold, for your kindness, as always. Wonderful, kind introduction. Can you hear me at the back, ladies and gentlemen? That's always the first thing to check, I think, when you're giving a public talk. If the lights could go down, please, then you won't have to look at me. The screen will is far more interesting, perhaps. Right. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a joy to be in New York in the spring, I must say. I come every year for my holiday, but usually in the fall, but this time the spring. And this year, an additional bonus is to be invited to take part in a seminar organized by the Department of Egyptian Art in the museum on the career of the general and later Pharaoh Haremhab, which the museum calls Haremhab. No, it's perfectly correct.
Thank you.
We also had this afternoon a round table, so to speak, on the very, very difficult question of ancient Egyptian chronology, which was most illuminating. In addition, I have this evening been given the chance to talk to you about my recent work in the Valley of the Kings, which involved the re-excavation of parts of King Haremhab's tomb. The Metropolitan Museum of Art authorities, Dr. Dorothea Arnold in particular, the curator of Egyptian art here, and the members of ISIS, I must remember them, the members of ISIS, the organization which supports the work of the Department of Egyptian Antiquities, have made my visit possible, and I'm deeply grateful. So, my association over 4 very, very happy years, I must say, with another expedition working in the Valley of the Kings from 1998 gave me the opportunity of examining most of the tombs, most of the royal tombs there, noting the existence in some of them of debris clearly remaining to be examined, including debris in the tomb of King Haremhab, numbered 57 in the King's Valley sequence of tombs. This slide I took donkeys years ago, not soon after I met Dr. Dorothea Arnold It would have been way, way back. And if we are looking down, we are looking, as she said, we are looking down into the Valley of the Kings. So it's an interesting shot, looking down into the valley. Here we go, yes. But before I begin to talk about the re-excavation of this tomb, just a very few brief words of introduction to talk about this military man, Haremhab, who began his career under King Tutankhamun, whom he served as regent during the early years of that young king's reign, from, shall we say, about 1347 BC. The mission I directed at Saqqara in the north of Egypt, an English-Dutch expedition from 1975, we had the good fortune, 3 days after we opened the site, to discover the magnificent tomb built for this man Haremhab while he was still a private citizen, while he was in fact regent of Tutankhamun and a great military general. I spoke about the discoveries there many, many years ago here in the Met, but I mustn't trouble you with that now. Tutankhamun died, as you probably know, very young, aged about 20 or so, and was succeeded as pharaoh by an official named I, who reigned only 4 years. When Tutankhamun died, by the way, the male line of the Egyptian royal family was extinct. So a military man, I took over for 4 years, and then it was then, about 1335 BC, that the general Haremhab became pharaoh. His fine tomb at Saqqara, which I just mentioned, was abandoned unfinished, and preparations presumably immediately began for work on his royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings, a tomb discovered and excavated by the American explorer Theodore Davis in 1908, in other words, just over 100 years ago. For orientation purposes, I'm sure many, many people in this room have been to the Valley of the Kings, of course. We're looking down into the central part of it. It's completely landscaped now, of course, because the enormous press of visitors, tourists and others, in all the major sites of Egypt, not least in the Valley of the Kings, and the Egyptian authorities, of course, in order to make it as easy as possible for these enormous crowds to move around, have had to landscape the terrain, so to speak, and to protect the entrances to the tombs and to take precautions against possible floods. For orientation purposes, the tomb of Tutankhamun is just down here on the bottom right. We move up this pathway, so to speak, and the tomb of Haremhab is over here. It's just about there. The entrance, the modern entrance to the tomb of Haremhab is just about there, as far as I can see. If I may just show you just 2 or 3 slides of the superb painted reliefs in the interior. This is one, followed by another. You can see the quality of the work. It's truly outstanding. But it's not my intention this evening, it's not part of the program, to talk about the tomb decoration as such. But I will concentrate on the objects found in the tomb which have a story to tell, as I hope to demonstrate. You may wonder why, after Theodore Davis's work, you may wonder why it was necessary 100 years later to re-excavate the tomb. The answer is that our predecessors often worked extremely rapidly, and much was lost or overlooked. In recent years, a new kind of archaeology has emerged in Egyptology. The re-excavation and analysis of sites and monuments cleared in the past by our predecessors, who often missed or ignored important clues, as I hope to demonstrate as I speak about the results obtained by my own tiny mission, the Cambridge expedition to the Valley of the Kings. There were only 2 professionals on board, myself and my colleague from the University of Groningen, Dr. Van Dijk, and I had a small team of local men, about 50 normally. And our work over 4 very short seasons was sponsored financially by two very good and very altruistic friends of mine, Piers and Jenny Litherland, and I take pleasure in mentioning their names because nothing could be done without their help. The entrance to the tomb of Haremhab was revealed, as I said, a century ago. The excavation of the monument proved to be Theodore Davis's last major project in the Valley of the Kings. After he'd cleared Haremhab, he announced that he thought the Valley of the Kings was more or less empty now, everything had been discovered. And so he upped and left, and of course, not all that, well, some years later, well, in fact, in doing so, in leaving the Valley of the Kings, he ultimately paved the way for the mission of the Earl of Carnarvon and Howard Carter. As you know perfectly well, their major discovery was the tomb of Tutankhamun, just a tiny distance away from the tomb of Haremhab. The tomb of Haremhab was revealed by Theodore Davis to be enormous in size, in fact one of the grandest in the valley, and most of the decoration was unfinished at the Pharaoh's death. It is, without any doubt, one of the most important monuments in Egypt for studying the various stages of work involved in planning and decorating a major tomb. The Theodore Davis's publication of the results of his work, the title page of which you see on the screen now, is magnificent, as were all his publications actually. It's magnificent, sumptuous in fact, in terms of its format. But opening it up, it's remarkably uninformative about the actual excavation and find spots of the objects. Now, it's easy to criticize Theodore Davis, most scholars do, but I'm bound to say that he was a man of his age. He financed some of the most remarkable work in the Valley of the Kings, and his name will always be remembered for making some of the most spectacular discoveries there. So let people criticize him, but he made a really astonishing contribution to our knowledge of the Valley of the Kings. Anyway, this is his book. I ought to explain, I think, well, you probably guess the name Haremhab there was one of the early 19th century versions of Haremhab, or Haremhab, as the Met calls it. Tutankhamanu is the old-fashioned way of spelling Tutankhamun, again in the early 19th century. Theodore Davis, as well as excavating Haremhab, he cleared a shaft just adjacent to the entrance of Haremhab's tomb and found there some very fragile gold foil fragments, some of which name Tutankhamun. So he thought he'd discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun, and so he's put the name on the title page. But of course he hadn't discovered Tutankhamun, he was just down the road, so to speak. The catalogue of the objects found by Theodore Davis was made and published in this volume by the French scholar, rather a famous French scholar called Georges d'Arécy. And it's a very important part of the book, of course, but it's selective. Only the most important or spectacular, in some cases, objects being chosen for illustration and detailed cataloguing. We shall see some of these objects on the screen in a moment or two. But the photographs in this book, I'm bound to say, are outstanding for their time 100 years ago. And I've had to use, as you will see in a moment, the black and white photographs, the archival photographs, to illustrate my talk. The photographs in this book were the work of a young Englishman, Harry Burton, whose name will be familiar to you, early in his career, before he went on to achieve immortal fame for his photographic record of the objects in Tutankhamun's tomb, discovered by Howard Carter, as I've said, in 1922. Davis's description of Haremhab's tomb occupies, believe it or not, only 2 pages in this publication, and these contain several questionable statements suggesting that the excavator was relying partly on his memory when he wrote his report, as we all do, of course. if we're honest. The longer and doubtless more scholarly account of the work in this tomb by his young collaborator, Edward Ayrton, another Englishman, was rejected by Theodore Davis for publication in this volume. Theodore Davis said it was too long. This very crucial document of Edward Ayrton has long since disappeared and probably no longer exists, which of course is a tragedy. Davis does not tell us how his work proceeded, though it's logical to suppose that the great quantities of limestone chippings from the original cutting of the tomb, which he found at the entrance to the tomb, and which continued as far as a deep well shaft part way in, would have been removed by his workmen to give them access to the corridors, staircases and rooms inside the tomb, which you see on this modern cross-section. If you imagine yourself standing at the entrance here and entering down a flight of steps, it's very, very steep, as you can see, a corridor, another flight of steps, a corridor, the first of the wonderfully painted, decorated rooms. You've seen slides of that. This is the well shaft coming down here. Yes, there it is. There's the well shaft, which I shall talk about. And then you another flight of steps, corridor steps, until you get down into the sarcophagus hall, a pillared hall, the room for the sarcophagus, a very large undecorated room behind the sarcophagus room, another smaller chamber behind, and an unfinished chamber, and storerooms for funerary equipment, and wine amphorae there. This is the cross-section. In fact, from the publication, quite a lot can be deduced from Harry Burton's excellent photographs, which I've already mentioned, and I shall show them in a moment or two. But I would like to mention that it happens that not one, you may be surprised at this, not one of the major royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings is definitively published in respect of its excavation history, its architecture, its inscriptions, its paintings, reliefs, funerary equipment and skeletal remains. The architecture, the texts and funerary objects in particular are crucial for an understanding of the fundamental concept of divine kingship in Egypt and the royal so-called mortuary cult, the cult of the dead monarch, which was planned to continue forever. And it really is ironic that one of our most important sources for the study of these matters, the tomb of Tutankhamun, is not really a royal tomb at all in respect of its architecture, so that its contents, with the exception of the objects found in the sarcophagus chamber of Tutankhamun, are not arranged in their correct positions in the various rooms of his monument. An added complication is that Tutankhamun's tomb was disturbed at least twice in antiquity, and the contents turned over, rifled and so on. Moreover, great numbers of the objects found by Carter still await definitive publication after 80 years. Well, now is the time to indicate some of the areas within the tomb of Haremhab investigated by the expedition. I emphasize again, perhaps I can go back just for a split second to, we were there already. I would like to emphasize the to emphasize the great distance from the well shaft here to the exterior of the tomb, up very steep stairways and ramps, as well as the enormous labour expended by Davis's expedition in removing the debris that certainly filled the approach corridors and stairs, as well as all the material he found in the shaft. A terrible job. One photograph in Davis's publication indicates that the shaft itself, there it is, was filled almost to the brim with debris in it before he excavated it, of course, so that he and Ayrton were able to get into the interior rooms and corridors without too much difficulty. And it's clear to me that after emptying the shaft, presumably that's one of the first things he did, although we shall never know because he doesn't tell us, after clearing the shaft, Theodore Davis decided to use that shaft, now empty, as an area in which to deposit debris found further down in the tomb, thus avoiding the problem of transporting enormous quantities of debris found in this area all the way up and outside, as we subsequently did with the debris he left behind in our re-excavation. If Theodore Davis had taken everything that he'd found outside, there would obviously have been nothing for us to find. So there we are. This is the original entrance to the tomb as it was found by Theodore Davis, and you can see the superincumbent chippings he cut down there, you see. And when the burial of Haremhab was in position, the great flight of steps going down into the entrance and then the long corridor was filled, I'm sure, to the ceiling with the chippings from the original cutting of the structure, just as Howard Carter found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. So this archival photograph is very, very interesting, not because it doesn't begin to resemble that now. There's a huge concrete structure over this area now, as with almost all the royal tombs, to protect them from floods. So this is a very, very interesting photograph. We see here the initial descent into the tomb with quantities of mason's chippings, as I said, that filled the approach corridor originally to the ceiling. But of course the robbers, when they came in, they didn't take out all the chippings. They just made a passageway, presumably over the top. The collapsed ceiling, I seem to remember, in the second painted room beyond the well shaft. And just to give you an idea of the kind of thing that Theodore Davis encountered, because the interior of the tomb was in a shocking state, not only because of the activities of robbers, but in particular because so much of the substructure was partly shattered by what must have been earth movements over the centuries. You see, and this tomb is unique with all these photographs. I can't think of another tomb that has such detailed photographs of the interior of such a monument almost at the moment of its discovery. This is the collapsed ceiling on the west side of the pillared hall, which you saw in the section. And the sarcophagus hall itself, exactly as Theodore Davis found it, with the lid thrown over, of course, by the robbers and smashed. I shall talk about the sarcophagus later on, towards the end of my talk. Fragments from the ceilings and so on. It was in a truly shocking state. Another shot taken from a different angle, but no, I must just mention this, if I may. I think in that shadow there, just in the distance on the west side of the sarcophagus, there it was never recorded by Theodore Davis or Edward Ayrton, or perhaps Edward Ayrton did, but we shall never know. It's an emplacement, a square emplacement for the reception of the so-called canopic chest, which was a piece of funerary furniture, as you perhaps know, which contained jars with the pharaoh's, some of the pharaoh's interior organs. That's where it was. It doesn't appear on the plan and so on and so forth. But now, of course, the floor of the tomb, as with the floors of so many of the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, covered with modern planking, so we can't get access to it, to record it. That's just by the by. Another interesting shot from the sarcophagus hall, looking outwards to the pillared hall, and you see these curious rectangular emplacements on the east wall and the west wall, the so-called emplacements for magical bricks. everything, I mean, the whole idea in these monuments, of course, was for the protection of the body of the divine Pharaoh in his sarcophagus. There were little images originally in there, but these, and they feature in quite a number of the royal tombs, including Tutankhamun's, and they were found intact. But these emplacements were never recorded by Theodore Davis or measured, and because I had a ladder available, I clambered up and, of course, made detailed measurements and so on for anybody in the future who will study the architecture of the tomb. Why don't we move now into the large undecorated room, which you saw again on the section of the tomb, with debris piled up. This is, as Theodore Davis found it, debris piled up against the wall there, great chunks from the ceiling. When of course, that was all examined and cleared by Theodore Davis, and I'm sure this is some of the material that was thrown back was taken up and thrown into the shaft. But when we entered the tomb in order to re-excavate it, there was an enormous pile of debris starting from just under the ceiling in this corner, covering, I suppose, about a third of the tomb. And this was what, in a sense, inspired me to inaugurate a reinvestigation, because I wondered, did Theodore Davis examine all this stuff? If he did he take out every tiny fragment? Unlikely. One or two objects, if you've got keen eyesight, you can even see there are one or two objects in situ here. At the back here, there is a wooden object which is the base of, I think it's the base of a so-called germinating Osiris. You may remember the one that Howard Carter found in the tomb of Tutankhamun, an image in the shape of the god of the underworld Osiris, filled with soil and planted with grain, which was watered, and then it germinated, a kind of symbolic a resurrection and rebirth. Maybe Ayrton studied all these things in detail in his report, but again, we shall never know. Oh, there it is. That's a better view of it. You see it there in the background there, and one or two wooden objects here. Of particular interest, now on the west side of the sarcophagus hall, there's a small, rather well-cut room with a beautifully painted image of the god of the underworld Osiris, still in more or less perfect condition after 100 years, thank goodness, although some of the paintings that you saw earlier have undoubtedly deteriorated. And the interesting thing about this room, again, one or two small objects scattered on the floor. But you see these two, I can scarcely see it myself from here, but can you see just propped up against the wall under the image of Osiris, two rather strange, bizarre wooden figures, so-called wooden magical figures, rather rare objects, which again are part of the scheme for protecting the body of the pharaoh. They were positioned, I won't go into details where I think they were positioned, but they were used as protecting pharaoh in some way. If you can make out the human-headed figure there, that's not surprisingly in the Cairo Museum, but the one with the ram's head, with arms outstretched, somehow escaped from the excavations and was purchased by the British Museum in 1912, together with 5 other wooden figures of the same class, which with very little doubt were also from Haremhab's tomb. You have to remember, you see, in these wonderful days in the past, the field director was often not on site. The work was simply left to his workmen, who were controlled by the foreman. And so, I mean, things, shall we say, went astray. Something we have to face. Now, if I may, just a selection of objects found by Davis, just to give you a kind of, not everything, of course, we don't have the time. Some of the objects found by Theodore Davis, most things smashed, of course, by the robbers, not just one team, but no doubtless people went in time and time again after the tomb was opened. In antiquity, I've mentioned the canopic chest. Here it is. It was smashed to pieces, here you see it, interestingly, on the way to being reconstructed. It's still far from complete. We found more fragments, as I shall show in a moment. A lid from the so-called canopic chest is coming up now, I seem to remember. Yes, there it is. Of course, it's now repaired. It's in much better state now, but mercifully, the face of exquisite workmanship is there. Another lid from a canopic jar, this time, interestingly, of a private person, not a royal person. Late 18th dynasty type, I suppose, perhaps, who knows, an associate of Haremhab buried in his tomb. We shall never know. A guardian figure of the king, coming up now. Large, very large wooden guardian figure, originally covered with, a very fine figure indeed, covered with gold leaf. And you can see how the original tomb robbers went in with their chisels or adzes, whatever they had, and just chipped off every tiny fragment of gold leaf. You can imagine them working down in the depths of this magnificent tomb with just, I suppose, oil lamps and so on. It must have been an utterly bizarre situation. Two of these. This is one of the figures I've already mentioned, I seem to remember. One that was in the Osiris chamber there. And a very fine figure of a striding panther covered in bitumen, this black material. A head from a couch representing the hippopotamus-headed Tarweret, the goddess Tarweret. Doubtless, again, also originally covered in gold foil. And here, a beautiful figure of the jackal god Anubis. Figure of the germinating Osiris, having to do with resurrection and rebirth, I've already mentioned. Here it is, both the base and the lid. You may know, at least the Egyptologists and those who take a particular interest in Egypt will see instantly there are very close parallels to these damaged and smashed objects found by Theodore Davis in the tomb of Haremhab. Howard Carter found objects in more or less perfect condition, similar objects, in the tomb of Tutankhamun. So these kind of things seem to be what we would say de rigueur, necessary for the survival, the protection of the divine Pharaoh, at least late 18th dynasty. But the fact of the matter is that we have enormous numbers of pieces of equipment from royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, but I don't know of any major overall study of the significance of these things. They were obviously extremely necessary. It's a major piece of research waiting to be undertaken, I think. Well, these are just some of the objects found by Theodore Davis, who mentions, or rather Deresi, the man who catalogued these things. In Davis's catalogue, Deresi remarks that besides these objects, some of which you've seen on the screen, besides these objects, there were found remains of objects not worth describing. They were happy days. Embedded intestines wrapped in cloth to imitate the appearance of a small mummy. One wonders what could be done with these kind of things if they'd survived today, with the advances that have been made. He says these must have been placed in the canopic jars. Fragments of statues of men and animals weren't worth recording. They were in bitumenized wood, objects covered in bitumen, parts of caskets for statuettes or for provisions. He mentions glazed ware, beads for necklaces, leaves of copper, and so on, not worth recording. But luckily, these pieces not worth recording, by and large, were transported, together with these kind of things, to the Cairo Museum, where our fine Egyptian colleagues gave Dr. Van Dyke and myself access to them the very end of our season, our last season, and it was all rather rushed and so on, but I did my best making proper catalogue entries for everything, while the photographs were taken by Dr. Van Dyke. Why don't we turn now to a selection of objects, mostly fragmentary, of course, because Theodore Davis found all these splendid things. These are the kind of things I'm going to talk about which he didn't, his workmen didn't bother to collect. All the material, the material in the from that huge pile of debris, as you can imagine it coming down from here, shall we say, this vast pile of debris. It's odd that the workmen didn't collect these, as it were. They were just simply left there, and these are very, very lovely blue glaze inlays of various sizes. We found, I seem to remember, several dozens of these beautiful things. We even found a fragment of bituminized wood with a couple still in situ and an emplacement on the left there for another. And there are fragments I haven't seen with my own eyes yet in the Louvre Museum in Paris, which with no doubt also came from the debris in this room behind the sarcophagus chamber. So, and what they come from, you may remember Howard Carter found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. There is a complete so-called Mehet Weret cow, double-headed cow couch. And these are the little trefoil inlays which we have, together with a few miserable fragments of what remains of these beautiful, beautiful figures. But curiously enough, I mean, this is magnificent object, of course, but the actual inlays are terribly blackened and almost carbonized, whereas, I'm bound to say, this is where we have one up on Howard Carter for once. We found, as I said just now, fragments of the canopic chest. I just show a couple of them. Hopefully one day these can be taken to the Cairo Museum once the dust settles there after the recent events, and maybe hopefully incorporated into the reconstructed canopic chest of Haremhab there. We found also quite a few beads. I mentioned those already, no doubt from necklaces and bracelets and armlets, that kind of thing. And something, I'm still talking about the material found in this gigantic pile of debris in the room behind the sarcophagus. These, because, not just yet, I think, is it? Let me just go back here for a moment. No, they're the beads. Yes, I'm going to mention now fragments of sandstone grinders. They don't look very much, but they were there for a certain reason, no doubt for processing flour. We also found a quern, the kind of things that these grinders would have been used on, and Tutankhamun had similar objects in his tomb, thinking about, of course, provision of food in the afterlife. There was another one. I'm so sorry. I'm going to go back just for a second. Maybe I'm pressing the buttons too quickly. Yeah, this is it, yes. These puzzled me for a split second because I was down in the tomb with my workman. Dr. Van Dyke was working on material. I'll explain in a moment where. But these puzzled me for a split second, and then I realized what they were. I wonder if you can guess. If you visualize them the other way up, in a sense, perhaps, they're the notched ends of arrows. And Tutankhamun, of course, as we know perfectly well, had many arrows as well as beautiful bows in his tomb. And of course, so bows and arrows were not least in the tomb of a man who was a military officer before he became pharaoh, would have been de rigueur. The beads we've already seen. And we found examples of in the debris there, several indications of ancient administrative activity. For example, seal impressions from the seal of the royal necropolis, depicting, as usual, the jackal god Anubis above 9 bound prisoners. And those with perhaps good eyesight can make that out. You can just see the tail of Anubis and the bound prisoners. These would have sealed boxes of beautiful objects and so on. That kind of thing. We found several of those. We found a number of handles from wine jars stamped with the inscription, "The Estate of Haremhab." There is one there. Just one of these stamped handles named his wife, Queen Mutnojmet. Pottery, ordinary pottery, is notably lacking in the tomb equipment. I mean, there must have been plenty of pottery, of course, there, but it seems to have been totally, almost totally discarded by Theodore Davis's mission. He doesn't even mention pottery in his book. I suspect that his workmen threw away most of it. We didn't find very much even in the shaft, where so much of the debris was subsequently dumped by Theodore Davis, although we did find some pottery, which I shall come on to in a moment. But one of the sherds we found is a typical painted sherd from a painted vessel, so-called blue-painted ware, with decoration typical of the time Tutankhamun to Haremhab, the late so-called 18th dynasty. And you see, we can't afford to ignore anything, can we, in these re-excavations? Nothing to write home about. It's simply a mud jar stopper from a very, very large storage vessel, and there's just a shadow of a stamp on it. We weren't able to make anything out of it. Why don't we move now to the well shaft, which I've mentioned more than once, an archival photograph taken over 100 years ago, showing, as you were, if we were entering here, you see, we come to the well shaft about a third of the way in. In one of Theodore Davis's photographs, you can see that the debris which he found when he entered the tomb came up to somewhere roughly there. So it wasn't very difficult for him and Edward Ayrton and his workmen to throw planks across from here to there in order to penetrate into the interior of the tomb. And of course it must have been a wonderfully excited moment for them all, wondering what was lying ahead. This photograph, by the way, all the original photographs in Theodore Davis's publication have disappeared, but here in the Department of Egyptian Art in the Met is a wonderful series of negatives of just scenes in the tomb, not identical with the ones in the publication, but other scenes, and this is one of them. We are looking now. This is the north doorway penetrating into what was originally the chariot hall, undoubtedly, and then steps going down and down and down, and corridors and so on and so forth. After Haremhab's burial in his magnificent sarcophagus, which we shall see in a moment, this area was bricked up, was blocked with limestone blocks, plastered over, and the scheme of decoration carried across. Of course, that didn't interest the plunderers. They simply smashed their way in. They demolished the tomb blocking there, and the blocks tumbled down into what was then, of course, a completely open shaft. We found many of the actual blocking stones in the debris at the bottom of the shaft, where they'd been thrown by the original plunderers, but I was hoping very much that fragments of the original painted decoration, which is absolutely magnificent, we would find there. And they must have been down there, of course, when Theodore Davis got to work, but either they were crushed by later debris coming in, or his workmen simply didn't recognize them and they were thrown out with the debris, and we shall never see them, lost totally. In fact, now we're talking about the shaft, there's always been some doubt whether Theodore Davis actually excavated the shaft down to the bottom. But if you look in Theodore Davis's publication, there is in fact a cross-section of the shaft made by his architect, another Frenchman called Émile Bérez, which shows quite clearly that it was in fact excavated to a depth of over 6 meters, so it's quite deep. And by the way, the shaft itself is 4 meters square. It's an enormous area. There was when I decided to ask for a concession to work there, I found out there was a local rumour on the West Bank, on the West Bank at Luxor, the area of the Valley of the Kings, current to the present day, a century after the excavation, that there were in fact 2 rooms at the bottom of the shaft, though these 2 rooms do not feature in Berezi's drawing or in Davis's commentary. Davis writes, this is what he says in his publication, if I may read it out, yes, he says, we came to an open well or pit. This was for the purpose of receiving any water which might find its way from the mouth of the tomb, and to aid in the discharge of the water, a smaller room had been cut in the rock next to the well, he says. Well, it's a somewhat enigmatic statement, and it probably does not refer to this kind of natural rock crevice which we encountered when we were re-excavating all the debris that he himself had thrown in. It can't refer to that. In fact, it must refer, doubtless, to when we ourselves got to the bottom eventually after a terrible job of emptying this shaft of all of Theodore Davis's debris. The bottom of the shaft is just about 7 meters, just a shade under 7 meters perhaps, and there we found 2, not rooms so much as short corridors, each 3 meters in length, one in the middle of the west wall here, and another in the northwest corner of the well shaft. Both were completely crammed with debris, which had set almost like concrete, from floor to ceiling, consisting mostly of broken blocking stones from the doorway above, which I've already mentioned. No objects were found in these rooms, which must have had some kind of symbolic function in the royal mortuary cult. One imagines other royal tombs have, not many, but some have rooms at the bottom of the shaft. But to my knowledge, there's no textual explanation of their use, perhaps some kind of symbolism of the underworld. Anyway, they were obviously de rigueur in some instances. In the shaft itself, in Theodore Davis's debris, I must come on to that now, we found a number of objects. I'll just show a few examples in the time that we have. By the way, all this debris, of course, this terrible debris we took out, or rather our wonderful workmen took out, and where other gangs of workmen were busy sieving everything so we could rescue, hopefully, every tiny fragment. We found so-called shawabti equipment, you know, these so-called substitute labourer figures, which were in many instances equipped with special equipment, in this case small hoes, the idea being that the substitute labourers would do agricultural work for the tomb owner in the afterlife. We found yokes and baskets for the use of these labourer figures. Curiously, I was hoping we would, but we didn't. We found no actual shawabti figures of King Haremhab. And in fact, to my knowledge, none is recorded in any museum of the world or private collection. If you can contradict me, I would be very, very pleased to hear it. But I've made inquiries from people who know about these things, and there are no shawabti figures of Haremhab, which is a very, very curious, inexplicable circumstance. He must have had them, probably as many as Tutankhamun did. As you know, he had an enormous number. So that's a puzzle. We found fragments, for example, of lotiform cups and other fragments of faience vessels of different kinds. We found bronze nails. Nothing to write home about, but they were there, doubtless from a very large item of funerary equipment, just speculating, of course, such as one of Haremhab's gold shrines, which he must have had, as Tutankhamun did, covering his sarcophagus, which contained his coffins. Also, and this made the whole enterprise worth struggling for, large quantities of, or quite large quantities of sherds, just broken pottery vessels, of a well-known type of wine jar, typical of the period Tutankhamun to Haremhab, many bearing inscriptions in ink, as you see here. There's one here. Now, many, quite a few of the sherds we found are on the second slide. You'll see a selection of these sherds. These I handed over to my colleague Dr. Van Dyke, who's a specialist in hieratic, and he was busy for the rest of the season joining them together, recording them and so on. And, of course, instantly we recognise in things like this, you see, this was a year date. This is year 14. And when sherds were joined and so on, it said year 13 and 14 of King Haremhab. That's to say, two of his regnal years, 13 and 14, as well in some instances the names of the vintners, the winemakers, and other details with where the wine came from and so on and so forth. And this material, which has been discussed today in this colloquium in the Metropolitan Museum, is, we feel, of crucial interest in the current discussion about the length of the reign of King Haremhab, which until this discovery was nobody queried that he reigned 27 years. In fact, for reasons that I can't go into now, you'll have to accept what I say. This new material we think we can, if not prove in a court of law, that would be necessary, but seems to indicate that he reigned no more than 14 years, which has excited the Egyptologists. And he may just have reigned into his 15th year. So at a stroke, we've eliminated 12 years from Egyptian chronology. And this is important because Egyptian chronology is crucial. I mean, because linked to it are the chronologies of the ancient Near East, the Aegean world and so on, the Levant, even as far afield as Babylonia, to some degree linked to the Egyptian chronology. So this is really quite exciting. Totally unexpected, how it was that, and by the way, all these sherds were found in the debris of the well shaft. They were certainly found by Theodore Davis's men, presumably further in the tomb, where the wine jars which they come from were stacked in one or more of the storage rooms down there. How it was, I mean, these may have been mentioned in Edward Ayrton's report, we shall never know, but they weren't thought worth collecting, which is lucky for us, of course. We're not complaining. From account of rims and bases of these wine jars, we know that Haremhab had at least 92 large wine jars in his funerary equipment, and the actual fabric of these vessels were examined by my colleague, Dr. David Aston, who is a great authority on this material. 92 he had in his plus. Now, we've turned finally to the sarcophagus, the king's sarcophagus, an extremely important item of funerary equipment in any royal tomb because it enclosed the embalmed body of the divine Pharaoh. Here we see it before the final restoration of the lid. The lid must have been pieced together. You saw the earlier photograph. It must have been pieced together soon after 1908 and put back. But the final restoration wasn't done until relatively recently. I can't find out exactly. This photograph was taken, it's from Professor Hornung's major study on the tomb of Haremhab, the inscriptions and reliefs. Beautiful photograph. And you can see that the lid there has not been finally repaired. You can see the crack going across the top. The lid was dropped in antiquity, perhaps during the funeral. Can you imagine the chaos and confusion that would have caused? And it was repaired by cutting in, you see two there, but in fact there are three. There's another one on the other side, little emplacements for clamps that held the fractured lid together. Exactly the same thing happened in the tomb of Tutankhamun. His lid was also dropped. The workmen were real butterfingers with these enormously heavy things. Anyway, when and as you can see, when this restoration was done, the lid was put on wooden beams. Over the years, during the period when the tomb was open to visitors, which was down, I suppose, from more or less the discovery until about 1994, when there was a terrible flood in the Valley of the Kings. The tomb was closed thereafter. But it was open to the public for many, many, many years. And it seems to have served as a kind of large post box, because items were pushed in under the lid by tourists and others. And by holding a flashlight under the lid at this end here, you could see, that's the east end, you could see that some, inside the sarcophagus, you could see bones, skeletal material, and one or two bits and pieces of objects. Not only that, but the lid was incorrectly oriented when it was put back. It's the wrong way round. It may have been the wrong way round in antiquity, for all we know. Anyway, it was on the wrong way round, and so of course one of the tasks that was necessary was to reorient it, to lift it up, can you imagine, not knowing whether the restoration had been carried out with steel pins or not, or whether it was simply held together with plaster. We received permission to lift the lid and to turn it round. And here's the marvellous band, or some of them, two expert stonemasons from Karnak Temple were brought in, and with this rather difficult, this enormously heavy thing was lifted with primitive but effective equipment. But you can imagine the tension when this was going up. If it had dropped on the marvellous sarcophagus, which is more or less in perfect condition, you can imagine I wouldn't be speaking to you now this evening. Anyway, we got it up, and before putting it back, excavated the contents here, and you can see some of the human remains. As I said, we simply can't afford to neglect this kind of... We're looking down into the sarcophagus. You can see there's a fragment there of a coffin, perhaps. All the kind of modern debris, of course, was removed. You see bones everywhere. Theodore Davis, actually, there's part of a skull there. Theodore Davis, in his report, he does mention bones, but he doesn't. He didn't bring in any expert to examine them, which was a great tragedy. Allegedly, they were sent to Cairo, but this was denied by Sir Grafton Elliot Smith, the man who would have received them. It's a great tragedy because we only have these tiny fragments from the sarcophagus and one or two minute fragments, which I myself collected from some of the side rooms. But Theodore Davis mentions skulls here and there, clearly. But this is even problematic, as I say. He doesn't say whether they were complete skulls or whether they were fragments of skulls. He says skulls, so we shall never know really. But the examination of the material which we found in the sarcophagus and in the side rooms, only a handful of bits and pieces. The physical anthropologist we brought in seems to feel that it may represent the remains of 3 persons. I decided while yes, there are some of these bones. While I was, the very first season, I was on my own for a couple of weeks just to initiate the work, and I noticed creeping around in the tomb, in one of the tiny side rooms on the ceiling, there was this lamp black, I just show part of it, lamp black inscriptions and other marks, which they don't seem to have been noticed by anybody. Graffiti, the kind of thing that you find in other royal monuments, you know, in the 19th century, before the invention, I suppose, of flash lamps and so on and so forth, or electric lights, people went into these monuments with burning flares and so on. There they are. And 2 are dated 1887, and one seems to be 1896 there. One graffito is a surname, apparently B-O-N, a curious sign, probably A-C-E Bonas or Bonace, and access to the internet shows that this is in fact a family name. There are quite a few Bonaces or Bonas, we don't know, in America as well. Either it's an Italian or French name, clearly. And here it seems that we have evidence that the tomb was entered years before it was officially discovered in 1908. And these years, I mean the late 1880s, beginning of the 1890s, it was a time when no official work was going on in the Valley of the Kings, and of course donkey's years before the advent of mass tourism. So it may well, it's a curious thing. It may even account, of course, for the appearance on the art market, for all we know, of other, I mentioned them already, these weird magical figures that protected King Haremhab in the British Museum. Of course, we shall never know. These were acquired by the British Museum in 1912. I just show one of them. Another one, a really weird one with a turtle head. These deserve a lecture in themselves, in a way. Here we go. Oh, by the way, I decided, it's almost time to finish. I decided that, or it suddenly dawned on me that while work was going on in the tomb, it dawned on me that no royal sarcophagus from the Valley of the Kings has ever been published in true facsimile. So I decided I'd already recorded the lid, which had never been recorded even in printed hieroglyphs or hand copies. That I copied in facsimile, but then I thought before we finish the work, it would be a good idea to record all the texts in this magnificent object. The only drawback, I mean, ordinarily it would have been the simplicity itself because the monument is in such superb condition, but I've already mentioned the wooden flooring here, and the sarcophagus itself, many years ago, the authorities, as with all the royal tombs which have sarcophagi in position, or more or less all of them, a wooden framework was erected all the way round, a kind of a fence almost. So I had the enormous difficulty of recording these texts by squeezing between these uprights and so on, and it wasn't at all easy. In fact, I miscalculated the amount of time it would take me, and I had to come back to Egypt again on my own for about a week or so just to finish off the work. Now, at least we have a reasonable facsimile copy of these texts. I thought it was worth doing while the opportunity was there. Lastly, ladies and gentlemen, you see it on the screen, a slide showing our foreman. He's the film star on the left there. Excellent man, whom the workmen respected. And not the entire team, because these were a small specialist team of local workmen chosen to lift the lid of the sarcophagus. In the middle, by the way, some of you will know Mr. Edwin Brock, an American Egyptologist who is very, very knowledgeable indeed about royal sarcophagi and other things. While the lid was lifted, I asked him if he would generously examine in detail the interior of the sarcophagus. A unique chance, and detailed measurements were taken and so on and so forth. In each corner on the floor there's a little kind of scooped emplacement on which there would have been a funerary bed on which what must have been magnificent series of coffins were containing the body of the king, the last one, were placed on this funerary bed. So he did that work for me. But this final image shows only a small part of my team of workmen. As I said, I had 50 altogether. They shared with me the dust, the terrible dust in that shaft and the room behind the sarcophagus room. They shared with me the dust and the heat and burden of the day. And I show this image as a kind of tribute to them, because they are usually anonymous in the many publications of Egyptian sites, which I think is a pity, because these wonderful, dedicated local men, I think Egyptology owes them much. There is more I could have told you, ladies and gentlemen, had time permitted, but I thank you for your interest.